Hi everyone, my name is Will de Beaurepaire and I wish you a very warm virtual welcome to our discussion today about my little family's winery here in Australia. I've prepared a little presentation. One of the great advantages of using Zoom and this new format of videos is I can share a lot more. And there's quite a bit to go through. We aren't a classic Australian winery. There's a lot more background to our decision making behind where we decided to make our wine and the styles of wine we actually make today, and you're getting to enjoy a couple of them. Without much more ado, I will start the presentation because it'll all hopefully come clear as we go along. So bear with me for a second. So as you can see here, nice little green background. This is the opening to our one direction of looking across our vineyard. Importantly is the French in spirit and Australian in body, because who is de Beaurepaire Wines? This winery was established by my parents, Richard and Janet, back in 1998. Interestingly, the previous generation, my dad's aunt and uncle, first started making wine in the Yarra Valley in 1970. So as a family, we've been making wine in Australia for nearly 50 years. But the name itself isn't an English name, it's a French name, and actually more specifically, it's a Burgundian name. From an Australian perspective, the wine industry here was mainly developed by the English, the Italians and the Germans. The French were notably absent, probably because for much of the early history of Australia, France and England weren't on the best of terms. But from us and the way that we view it, being a Burgundian family, our name actually has a very good meaning. I think it has a great reflection with the winery that we've built. Beau means beautiful or good, repair means hideaway. So we are of a beautiful hideaway. And that is very much the ethos that we've built this around. This is a destination vineyard. It's all about the vineyard, very much that French approach. And that's a very important delineation I think you'll understand as you go through this presentation. From all of that, we were able to win Best Wine in Australia in 2018. So this was out of about 10,000 wines judged. It was the first time in 40 years of that competition that a winery from New South Wales won that trophy. So we are traditionally Victorian. The Yarra Valley is a great wine region just near Melbourne. We are now located at Rylstone, which is just near Sydney. So I'll give you a little bit of an explanation of that. Obviously a nice map of Australia here. As you can see down here, Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, which hopefully you're all fairly familiar with. And this little red flag shows where we are. So the Yarra Valley is down here, just near Melbourne. Obviously we're up here in New South Wales. And here gives you, on the right, gives you a much clearer picture of where we are. Sydney down here on the bottom right. You drive out here, this is called the Blue Mountains, or the Great Dividing Range. Magnificent countryside. It's all national parks, forests, mountains, cliffs, very dramatic scenery. And we are just on the western side of that range, which is quite important, as you'll discover in this presentation, at this little town called Rylstone. It's near Mudgee, which you may be aware of. It's about 10,000 people, or Bathurst down here, which is quite famous for its university. So still very much in these Blue Mountains and the ranges, and it gives you an understanding of where we're located. So in terms of the way that we've approached, as I indicated, we've approached this as French Australians. We see ourselves as stewards of our land and honouring in particular our Burgundian ancestors. We are and seek to make what is called a French winemaking style. If you're really wondering what that is, what we're looking for are wines that are elegant, they're balanced. So we're talking here about acid and flavour in particular. So they feel very balanced on the palate, and they're age-worthy styles. It's quite easy, or not that easy, but it's much simpler to make a great wine that lasts a couple of years than to make one that can remain great over 10 to 20 to 30 years. And that's the real benchmark against which great wines are judged. And look, most importantly, we're trying to capture the variations of our vintages. You know, you can't fight Mother Nature. You've got to work alongside her now more so than ever. And with the French, you know, it's all about the vineyard and that location. So you want to capture what you've got, where you come from, your provenance. And you're trying not to intervene too much. You're trying to hold back. the winemaking. And most importantly, we're also trying to regenerate the land, not just sustainable, but trying to actually improve the land on which the vineyard is located. And we do that using various approaches, so things like green manures, which rebuild the soil structures and rebuilding native and flora, biodiversity zones around it, which actually have an enormous advantage in the vineyard because you have great pollinators and you also have great natural predators of a lot of the bugs that cause the diseases that historically we've had to spray harsh chemicals to control. We're really here about working with our environment, within our environment, and trying to make great wines that reflect that environment. And that is the French approach. So when you talk about wines here in Australia, you tend to hear the use of cool climate versus warm climate. That may be evident overseas, but I've noticed Australian wines overseas tend to be fairly generic, where they have no regionality beyond, say, Southeast Australia, or maybe a couple of the very famous original wine regions. Here on the right actually shows in black all the Australian wine regions. There are a lot of them. There are 14 alone in the state of New South Wales. But in Australia, you tend to hear a lot of the wine media and the journalists, the sommeliers, and they talk, if it's a cool climate, it's great. If it's a warm climate, it's not great. It's very misleading. It's much more about the variety, the grape variety. So if you're planting French varieties, so the Cabernets, the Chardonnays, the Pinot Noirs, the Semillons, yes, you want something that's a bit cooler because that's the way that the acidity and the ripeness really lends itself towards. But if you're planting a Spanish variety like Tempranillo or Grenache, or even some of the new Portuguese varieties that are becoming quite trendy, or the southern Italian varieties, the Nero de Avalos in particular, which are very trendy these days, you want to be in a warm climate. They do not develop properly in a cool climate. And this is all to do with working with nature. These varieties have evolved over thousands of years to work in their environment. And so if you find the environment similar in Australia, you want that southern Italian variety, you need to find an area in Australia that feels, or the climate is similar to the southern Italian climate. So for us, French, Burgundian in particular, we're looking at the cooler end. And you can see that obviously the French regions are light blue. This is important, but it's not the whole story at all. But interestingly, we're right down here at the very cool end. This is Tasmania, that little island just off south of Australia, and then Central Otago and New Zealand, a very famous area now, growing fantastic wines. So the way though the French look at it, they look at it much more holistically. So they use a term called terroir, and terroir is the combination, yes, of that climate, but it's not just temperature, it's location. Is it on the coast? So is it a coastal or maritime climate, or is inland continental climate? Is there hills and folds and valleys? Are you below tree lines? Are you above tree lines? Is there a wall adjacent to your vineyard that may pull the cold air behind it, hold back the cold air as it gradually slides down a hill on a very cold morning? So your topography is really important for that. Are you along a river? It's actually incredibly important, especially for sweet wine production. Obviously, the flora and fauna, as I said, the trees around it, but also the native and sometimes the introduced species. But we're talking everything down here, lady beetles, which are magnificent predators of most of the pests in the vineyard. It's quite incredible when you think of how beautiful a little ladybird is, but for most pests, they're terrifying. And most importantly, it's the soils. And we'll talk a little bit about what influence soils have to play in the vineyard, and it's quite a substantial role. The real catch-all is here in Australia, you hear a lot of discussion about winemaker. I tend to avoid the term. If I'm going to use the term, it's wine grower. We grow wine because the vineyard makes the wine. In France, there is actually no term for winemaker. The term is vigneron, and vigneron is all about the vines, and that's why when you're talking about it from this whole French approach, is Australia classically takes it from the winery, and you see that with a lot of the big wines that you probably approach overseas, They're the blends of hundreds of vineyards. There is no provenance or local personality. It's a real tour de force of a winemaker who is taking a lot of different ingredients and producing a wine and trying to produce a consistent product. But in that process, you can sometimes lose the personality. Whereas the French are the vineyard, the personality of that vineyard. Put that in a bottle, don't mess it up, is their approach. So vigneron, not winemaker, is the French approach. So if you take this back a little bit, remember that we had that vertical axis on the before we're talking about temperature, so this is still the same now, but they've all been spread out, all these regions. It's because of this horizontal axis, the acidic, neutral, and alkaline, and this has to do with soil. So I'm not sure if you have to dig back to your school chemistry classes. It makes it a lot more interesting talking about chemistry and geology and biology when you're using wine as the crutch or as the demonstration tool. But the way to think of it is obviously most soils are classically quite acidic, especially older soils. Australia has quite old soils. We're the oldest landmass in the world. Some of the original rocks here are some of the earliest. So they've been leached with a lot of rain, which rain is quite acidifying, and a lot of soils, if they come from volcanic soil in particular, your basalts and your granites are quite acidic. And that's why a lot of Australian regions are on the regionally acidic soils, whereas you notice that all the French regions are within this zone here where they're mildly alkaline. And alkaline, is the opposite of acidic, and thinking sodium bicarbonate or bicarbonate soda, which is great for unsettled stomachs. That's alkaline to an extent. And so all of their French regions have gravitated to this fairly concentrated position within this temperature versus soil type. And that's been through a process of thousands of years of trial and error. There were vines planted in many more locations in France than there are today. And over time, the successful ones were which were allowed to continue and were invested in, and they are the regions that we now have today. And over that time as well, the varieties worked themselves out too. So taking back to us to France with our mentality, let's talk a little bit about the French regions, and particular Burgundy, our homeland. And so Burgundy, as you'll see, this is like a nice big couple of target circles, some squiggly lines. They really are quite simple to understand. But what you'll probably pick up very quickly is where Burgundy is located. Here, right in the middle of France. It's called the stomach of France for a good reason. A lot of French cuisine, a lot of French cooking styles and food styles come from Burgundy. You'd be surprised how many, but also obviously great wine too. So wine and food are a great evolutionary match. They've evolved together, and you'll be surprised when you start going to the region and you drink their traditional food with their wine, it starts to make sense. So in terms of the food matches, in terms of the wine styles, they have evolved. So I'll explain some of these little squiggly lines. So as I said, Burgundy is right in the middle. So it's 400 kilometers from La Manche, the English Channel, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. It is not a coastal climate. It's not like Singapore. It's not like Sydney. It's a fair way inland. And what happens there is you lose the regulating temperature influence of the ocean. The ocean doesn't change temperature that much, regardless of season. It doesn't heat up and cool down in summer and winter that much. So it makes it quite enjoyable to live by the ocean. As you move further from the ocean, as you move further inland, you lose that influence of the ocean, and you end up with this environment which has hot days, cold nights, big temperature changes overnight. If any of you have been out in the desert, you will have seen that, especially when the soils can't retain heat. It loses all the heat at night. It gets brutally cold, even in summer. So this is what an inland climate is like. So it's called a diurnal variation. It means a big difference between nighttime temperature and daytime temperature. And that's where you can see here, it's climate oceanic with an influence of the continent. So this green zone is where Burgundy is located. And I've got a little picture here, which just effectively is saying is obviously there's a large heating up and a large cooling down over the day. What that means from viticulture is obviously vines and plants. They rely on photosynthesis, the sunlight, to drive that engine of growth, but also the development of sugar within a grape. So it drives the ripening process. The sunlight drives the ripening process of fruit. And in this environment, it's a slower process because there's warmth during the day. Optimal photosynthesis is actually 26 degrees Celsius. So as you get too hot or too cold, it isn't optimal, it slows down, or sometimes happens too quickly. And so you have this photosynthesis during the day and it's all working lovely. Then at night, it closes, the doors slam shut and it slows right down. It takes a while to pick up and then take off each day. So that stop-start process means that the ripening of the fruit happens in a more steady manner, which gives the ability for not just the development of sugar, which is alcohol, but the development of flavor, which is so important. We're not trying to make an alcohol, we're trying to make wine. And wine's about flavor, and it's about structure. And those come from a much steadier form of ripening, in particular with the varieties that we're talking about in Burgundy, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which have naturally very thin skins. And those thin skins, to give you an idea, why they need to thicken, because if you want to understand the importance of skin, look at a rosé. A rosé is just a red wine, a red grape, without the use of skins in winemaking. So you can imagine the thicker the skins, the more skins are involved, particularly with Pinot Noir, a red variety, the more flavor and the more structure is imparted. And that brutalizing cold and hot day also makes the skins thicken up, or bruise, depending which way you want to look at it. So they become a little bit thicker again. Once more flavor, more structure. And that's sort of the secret to Burgundy's thicker skins and flavoursome wine structures, perhaps against New World Pinot Noirs being grown on the coast. So that's sort of, I guess, a little bit of an introduction in terms of you've got climate, important, very important, cold, hot, diurnal, Mediterranean. But if it was just about temperature and being 400 kilometres from the coastline, why is Burgundy, and this is a planting map of Burgundy, so narrow in its plantings? So you're talking here, the best bit of Burgundy is the two areas. One is Chablis, the other is this area called the Côte d'Or, and it's broken up in the Côte de Beaune and the Côte de Nuit. It's the Côte de Beaune here and Côte de Nuit up here. And that's only 60 kilometres long. But more importantly, it's only about 1 kilometre wide, and some of the best bits are only a couple of 100 metres wide. So if it was climate and location, why is not every single valley planted with vines? This is one valley, and a very small part of that valley is planted with the best vines in the world. So there's obviously a much larger influence at play than just climate. So that was important from a general regional perspective, but where to actually plant the vineyard in that region, it's much more a geology exercise. This is, before we get a little bit going, oh my gosh, there's too much color going on here. This is a geology map of France. And the way to think of this is, as you'll notice, you've got two things here. Notice the Aquitaine Basin, which is down around Bordeaux, southwest France, and you've got the Paris Basin, which covers most of northern France. And you have to go back 150 million years ago. This was the era, it's called the Jurassic era, the era of Sam Neill and Jurassic Park. But on a serious level, it was an era where all the continents, especially of the Northern Hemisphere, were combined together into this supercontinent called Pangaea. And as it started to break apart, the seas surrounding rushed into the gaps, into the lower areas and into the moving apart continents. And it started covering up various parts of the land. And it covered up the low points like the Paris Basin and the Aquitaine Basin. So at that time, these were very shallow seas. The continent was also located on and around the equator, much like Singapore. And so it was much warmer. So these warm, shallow seas, which were teeming with sea life, and their coasts were covered in shellfish. And that's the really, really important part of it. As you can see here, this is really narrowing down. You can see Burgundy is located just here on the coastline, and Champagne was actually just off the coast. It was actually out in the shallow sea. Burgundy was on the coast. And why is that important? Well, if you've ever looked into whales, you'll understand that they eat plankton. So plankton are some very microscopic sea life. They love this environment, and as they died, they gradually built up layers on the sea floor, and those layers over 150 million years have become chalk. So if you're thinking chalk with your pencil, chalk with your pen, that's the chalk that you see in Champagne. And on the coastlines, much like coastlines, all around islands and other areas and coral reefs, you get lots of shellfish. And the shellfish, over 150 million years, become limestone. And you can actually see this is a soil picture, and this is actually a person holding up a fossilized shell in Burgundy, 400 kilometers from the sea. So in this area of Burgundy in particular, this limestone soil, the shellfish from 150 million years ago comes to the surface and near the surface, and it starts interacting with the topsoils. And that's where the real magic happens. So if any of you have got a bit of a gardening plot, you like to garden, you would like to garden, you'll understand the importance of calcium. And way that calcium, we're talking here with eggshells or maybe garden lime, is that you use it to raise up the pH level, so to make acidic soils alkaline. So remembering that chart at the start where you had all those acidic soils and you had all the French vineyards on the alkaline soils. Now the Australian vineyards get around it. We use a lot, well traditionally, a lot of Australian vineyards use a lot of lime, crushed it up, spread it around, and it gradually filters down from the surface down, but over time it washes away. So you have to keep applying it. Whereas the French, they didn't understand that science 1,500 years ago, but they knew that these soils produce something pretty special. The limestone is really near the topsoil, so the lime influence comes from the bottom up, which means it's always there. It's consistent, persistent, but also importantly, it's right where the root zone wants it. And the reason why the root zone wants it is because you'll see here, it's about nutrients. So multivitamins and minerals, just like we need for our health and well-being, our vitamin C's and B's and irons, so do plants. They need their borons and the nitrogens and the magnesiums and their irons, all for the same reasons we do, for skin health, for foliage health, for immune system responses, especially if you're looking to try and get the vines to do a lot of the pest defense or disease defense, so to reduce your spraying and your use of chemicals. You want healthy vines, and you'll notice that they're all much more accessible. These minerals are much more accessible at this mildly alkaline environment. So think of it this way. So the soil has a stomach. We have our stomach, it's on the inside. When it is in balance, when you've had your yogurts or you're healthy, it performs really well, you're healthy. But say you've had a course of antibiotics, or your diet's been bad, or you've got some other problem, you notice that your whole physiology, your whole body starts not doing great, even up to mental health issues. So vines have their stomach on the outside. Their root systems are just like our stomach. Job is to take in these nutrients, but they can't just take a piece of iron and take it up through a root. They need an intermediary, and those intermediaries are just like ours. All this, we call our gut biome, but it's the soil biome. It's the protozoas, it's the fungi, it's the bacteria that break this down, all this material down, and make it and secrete it into the soil and make it accessible. So they are happier and healthier in this environment that's mildly alkaline, where there's limestone around for vines. And what that means is that the vines don't need as much soil. They become, because the soils are more efficient. So if all you're talking about fuel efficiency means you need less fuel to get from A to B. Well, soil efficiency means to keep a healthy, happy vine. If the soils are efficient, you don't need as much soil. So the big misnomer that you hear a lot about in viticulture, but in a lot of, is, I want deep soils because it's great. That's human psychology. We like to think of ourselves as deep-rooted, roots going deep into the earth, making us stable and strong. Vines, on the other hand, the opposite. You actually want these shallow soils. There's a really important reason for it. And this is where it starts getting into the wine side. So the vines are healthy with these soils, but the shallower soils have an advantage for grape growing. And that is looking at this picture here. On the left is table grapes. Table grapes are what we buy from the supermarket, refreshing. They're great for, after a hot day, but they're full of water. They're big and succulent. That's great, but it doesn't mean there's a lot of flavor. You actually don't want too much flavor. Because on the right, you'll notice these are wine grapes, tiny, small, very intense flavors. And not that enjoyable actually just to eat, a lot of, to be honest. But this is what you want for wine. You want that intensity. You want that concentration of juice. And how that comes about is because those shallow soils we talked about are efficient. The vine is healthy. When it rains, there's not that much moisture retained. There's not a deep well or large amount of soil which retains the moisture. It's gone. So the grapes become water stressed. Water stressed, they become smaller. So on the left, the table grapes are obviously full of water, very refreshing, done by either irrigation or deep soils. On the right, the grapes are water stressed. And so the grapes become very small and are lacking in fluid, which is great because more flavor, more intensity, really important for wine. The French trial and error, thousands of years, these limestone soils enabled the production of quality grapes. So just a quick one, Louis Roederer here, Cristol, so it's the most expensive champagne in the world, 50 centimetre deep soils, very shallow. And actually this is one of their vineyards here, straight onto the chalk at 50 centimetres. Or here we have Domaine Romanée Conti, the most expensive wine in the world, very crappy soils, so pardon the technical term, but soils that are, very rubbly. They've got enough nutrients. The vine is more than happy, but not retaining a lot of moisture. And it best happens on this mid-slope of the hills of that valley in Burgundy. We're talking about that best bit being maybe only a couple of 100 meters wide, is that middle zone. And because erosion has washed the soil down the hill, and there's just enough soil for the wine to get enough. And the deep soils and the valley floors, which have, it's called colluvium, where all the soil's been pushed down there. Deep soils is where the cheap Burgundy, I'd buy Australian wine over cheap Burgundy any day of the week. But this middle zone, this is truly magical. So that's pretty much it in a summary. Limestone soils or chalk make efficient soils, and they're neutral, alkaline, gives a healthy, happy vine, enables a shallower soil profile. You don't need as much soil because the soils are efficient. That makes the grapes water stressed, producing smaller berries, giving more flavour and structure to wine. It's called the Holy Grail in viticulture. That's why a little bit of a joke on the right. Obviously seeking the Holy Grail in a wine glass. So that brings us to us. This is a little bit of a cheeky picture. This is obviously on the Route de Grand Vin, so the famous wine road or route through Burgundy, and a nice little picture of us being 12,742 kilometres away, which is the diameter of the Earth. So if you went straight through, you get to us from Burgundy or thereabouts. But being Burgundian, this was important. Now, this is a picture of our vineyard now. What you can see here is we're on a little bit of a valley. There's a river off to the left, and there's some slopes down to it. The distance across from where we're standing here to the very far side and down the other side, there's more vines, is 1.5 kilometres. So quite a distance, and the width is about up to about half a kilometre wide. So very similar to Burgundy. So hopefully that's a bit of a giveaway. A lovely, beautiful area of the world. Importantly for us, yes, we needed cool climate. We're looking for zone 7, which zone 7 effectively means the same temperature range as probably you're getting in Europe. It's cold, it does snow, and you'll notice there's quite a bit of it in Australia. Mainly on the mainland of Australia, it's altitude related in the mountains, especially up here. This is the border of Queensland, but down here in Tasmania, you're getting to latitude reliant, but same temperature. Tasmania, as you remember, us and Tasmania were the same temperatures. But really the secret to what we were there for was the fact that, remember that Pangea story of 150 million years ago in Sam Neill's Jurassic era? If you go back 450 million years from today, it's called the Ordovician era. It wasn't as exciting. There was no Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was the era of shellfish, so invertebrates. And what better era for the development of limestone? And like there was Pangea, which was the creation story of the Paris Basin and the French regions, we had Gondwana land, which was the other great supercontinent. And you can see the various current nations sort of all squashed into it. And importantly, there was this chain of volcanic islands just off, or barrier islands of volcanoes just off the east coast, or east coast. And it extended all the way up here to what you can see part of Australia was, Western Australia was above and most of Australia was submerged. And in this zone between the two, between the volcanoes and the mainland, you had quite a shallow sea, quite a calm sea. Calm seas enable shellfish and they enable coral reef. And this is very much a similar story to Burgundy's or France's development. So what you had is you had that, as you can see, this was off those volcanoes, and you had this shallow sea, and you had these lines of coral reefs, and behind them, obviously, limestone has developed. It's very old geology in Australia. So this is 450 million years old. So there's been some newer shifts since then. 250 million years ago, Sydney, where Sydney was pushed out of the water. The Great Dividing Range, the Blue Mountains, was pushed out of the water. It's sandstone, so it's sea floor, different to chalk, obviously just general sand. And that's overlaid a lot of this limestone, so it does disappear. You see it if you get the chance. You'll go to Jenolan Caves, just west of Sydney, not far from us. Beautiful cave system in limestone, obviously. And we found this little area ourselves. Rather than walking around, you can find it maybe by a pH, so an acidity testing kit. It'd take a long time. The way you find limestone near surface is you go looking for, actually very quickly, see Rylstone here. You can see next to it is a little town called Candos, and where we are. The way to find this is you go looking for cement, because cement is crushed limestone. And cement isn't a very lucrative product. It's not gold or platinum. You know, you're not going to go and dig it hundreds of meters from below the ground. It's got to be pretty much at the surface. And right next to Rylstone, right next to it is another little town called Candos. And Candos is very famous. It's called the town that built Sydney. It's a tiny town, but it had a very, very, very successful limestone business. You can see it, Candos Cement, building the Harbour Bridge, building a lot of the buildings of Sydney. And once we knew that, it was inland, it was cold, we're high altitude, 650 meters. We knew we're looking around the right area. We found our little valley that enabled us to generate the characteristics just like Burgundy and Champagne around here. So like cold climate, mildly alkaline soils, real viniferous heaven or vineyard heaven. Definitely a holy grail, which is great for our surname being a beautiful hideaway. So Rylstone, if you ever get the chance, when you fly into Sydney and you get in a car or a chopper or even a light plane, come out. This is old country area, beautiful stone towns. So 130, 140 year old. I call it country light in Australia. You have yoga instructors. We have baristas making beautiful coffees. A lot of artists now live in this area in particular. We actually have the best regional yum cha in Australia. Beautiful story, good friend of ours, Nalan. She's from China. Her husband, Reg, is Australian. They met in China. She was in TV, he was in advertising, both very artistic. He had some land near us. They got married, moved there, and they decided they'd become artists and painters. But to pay for it, they realized they need to have some income source in the meantime. So she started making her family's dim sum and all the dumplings, and makes them by hand. Her mum's now moved out and she's in the back room, and beautiful, like amazing terraces. Not what you expect in a country town, but so hence I call it country life. Beautiful area of the world. We're very lucky to be there. So that's the culmination of our overview. I'll talk a little bit about the wine separately, and we'll do a little bit of a Q&A with the general manager shortly. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone, and fantastic to be on a virtual from Singapore to Rylstone in a beautiful New South Wales with Will. I'm Bruno Cristol, the area general manager for IHG Intercontinental Hotel Group in Singapore, and we are delighted to be part of as well of this amazing future promotion we have soon. But today it's all about the wines from this beautiful winery. So I have a couple of questions for you, Will, if it's okay.
Of course. Hi everyone. I hope you're enjoying your stay with Bruno.
They all will.
Absolutely.
Will. All right. So just the first question, Will, is how does de Beaurepaire Wines differ from most of the other Austrian wineries or wines as well?
It's a great question, Bruno. With my very strong French accent, as everyone can hear, we are an Australian-French family, so I think we're called Frozzies here in Australia. Now it's been enough generations that my ability to speak French has diminished, but we were always guided by that French influence in the way that we approach the wine industry, approach our viticultural practices, how we run our vineyard and how we make our wine. They all came from a different perspective, but none with that minutiae sort of viewpoint, that real microscope down onto the vineyard that the French bring, with the terroir, and especially our family being Burgundian, the climat in particular, that real micro level of knowledge. So that was really important for us. So that vineyard focus, the vigneron rather than the winemaker. So then the next step was beyond having the conditions, was producing wine that was similar to France. So that really is, because it's a vineyard-driven wine, you're not trying to intervene, you're not using a lot of very heavy-handed winemaking techniques. You're about capturing the vineyard in a bottle. But for us, reduced oak, looking for freshness, looking for food matching, which is so important from a cultural, historical perspective in France as well. These were all the driving things that we were looking for, and it's quite different to Australia. Most big Australian wines are 100 vineyards, like a Penfolds, 100 vineyards. There isn't individual vineyard characters within that wine. It's different to us. We are one vineyard, one wine, and each year it changes depending on the vintage conditions as well.
Great. Well, excellent. Very happy to hear the French did something right. I'm half French, by the way, and Australian. I was amazed as even Bordeaux born to be very proud and chauvinistic, but the style of wine, as you say, and taste was quite different, obviously, and it was really a good eye opener for me. And I was only 88, where your wines, all the Australia wines around the world were not yet called New World. It's a bit later, I think. My second question is, what I found in Australia, there's always, the winery have 1, 2, or 3 wines that are doing super well for whatever, as you say, type of style. But your winery have over 16 varieties, different style, as you say. So I wonder how you do it, and what's exactly your not strategy, but how do you combine all these 16 wines and doing so many great wines and award-winning?
It's a good question. My father, it's probably a lack of self-control between my father and myself. We keep making wines and we keep thinking up new ideas. And what about this wine? And what about that wine? So we planted varieties with the intention to sell the fruit. So we planted varieties back in the 90s, where Australia was still very much, rising as as informative premium wine production in the 90s. We were a fortified wine producer for England back, 1960s and before, and gradually into premium production of wine. And there's only some varieties, Semillon from the Hunter Valley, McLaren Vale, and Coonawarra Cabernets, Barossa Shiraz. They were really your benchmark varieties. And so we planted Cabernet, Shiraz, Semillon, varieties that we knew other wineries wanted, and they were going to form the backbone to our cash flow, which enabled us to then gradually leverage into the Burgundy varieties of Chardonnay and Pinot. But in that process, we discovered that each of those varieties was able to produce something quite magical. We seemed to win awards across the range, and so what started as effectively grape sales driven diversity to create some revenue to sort of keep us in a business sense enabled us to experiment and discover and make these wonderful wines. And the rest is sort of history. Each time we keep expanding, the demand is there.
Great. Well, that's very detailed and very interesting, because that gives us a good snapshot of why you have so many varieties and styles and doing so well. So I take my segue and going on to a different thing, leading to the award winning. You won in 2018 Australian Wine of the Year, obviously judged out of 10,000 wines, if I recall. That's an amazing achievement, pretty outstanding. I mean, 10,000 wine, as you say, Bordeaux, could be South Africa, American, whatever, English a bit perhaps. So it was quite an amazing achievement. What exactly, or how did you do it?
And as we've moved ourselves into the future, into the modern world, which is to work with nature, you can't fight, especially in a vineyard. It's very expensive too, and it needs a lot of harsh chemicals to do it, which hurts the vineyard soils in particular. We decided 2013, let's try and work with the Semillon, because this pea soup fog really, it piles up in a corner of our vineyard, which is on a river bend, and that's where we've got Semillon planted, and we've also got Viognier planted, and we gave up fighting it. We let the botrytis, I guess, develop within that Semillon. And 2013, we made a sweet wine. It did pretty well. It came second best in all the New World. So we beat the Americans, the South Africans, the Chileans, Argentinians, the rest of Australia. We got beaten by New Zealand, by Framingham. It's a great winery there. But we thought, that's an El Dorado moment. Is it replicable? We seen the gold mountain or the golden bottle, and we weren't sure we could do it again. So we didn't hold out hope. 2016 came around, similar conditions. We thought, we did pretty well last time, let's give it a go again. It's fascinating. This is the wine industry. You know, you have an ideal in your mind, and Mother Nature or the market or something practically turns you around and sort of goes, no, go left, not right. And that was it. So we won this incredible trophy. It was the first time in 40 years that trophy. It's the Wine State Wine of the Year Award. It's been going 40 years. 40 years, no New South Wales wine has ever won it, and no sweet wine has ever won it.
I drink to that. Congrats again.
Cheers to that.
Drink.
Thanks, Bruno.
Sorry, I don't have any sparkling or champagne, but next time.
I've drunk it all. It was in the house, but it's all gone.
And I heard as well you recently won in 2021 the TripAdvisor Choice Award, which is like the top 10%. So that's fantastic as well. And TripAdvisor, as we all know, all travelers and foodies are really looking at that. So that's another great one. So next question is just on you're a sustainable grower. And what does it entail, and how do you see the future on this sustainability?
Absolutely. This is a real topical question, I think, these days. We've got to, we talked about it just before with the botrytis, is working with what nature gives you rather than fighting it. And you know, we know, like, the vineyard soils are full of microbiome. It's a microbiome. It's full of fungi and protozoa, and they're really important for the vine health. And you spray them with chemicals, it kills them. It's like having antibiotics on the impact on humans. You know, you've got to then rebuild your stomach biome back up. So it's much more working with what you have. So one is really important to support the health of the vines, making them healthier, make their immune systems better. So we use things like green manure. So rather than using chemical manures, so effectively our mid-rows look like a vegetable garden. That's been quite important. You slash them so you don't till the soil. So what you want to do is you want to retain the root zones. It's really important that agriculture is potentially one of the biggest carbon sinks in the world. And the fact that you can as long as you keep the cover crop intact, you don't till it. So what we're saying is not turning the soil over and breaking it up, so killing the roots. That's been a big positive, and that's been something that these things combined helps the health, helps the environment. We're looking at using insectariums. So that's some of this really cool stuff that's coming through. Where you're using lady beetles and lacewings. Like, who would have thought lady beetles were a murderous bug, but they go after a lot of the pests in the vineyard, and they chomp through everything. So you want to promote them. So you're building effectively flower beds around your vineyard to try and promote them. So these are sort of, I guess, some of the bits and pieces. So it's not just about sustainability. I think the future for agriculture here in Australia, but everywhere, is regeneration as well. So giving it back better than we received it. So that's sort of where we're going, and increasingly improving upon it. It's a really developmental world out there as we understand more about it, but we also start listening to alternative views. We're starting to really appreciate much more to be gained by working with Mother Nature than against it.
Okay, great. As you explain and you show your passion with a family business, being a family winery, do you have a long-term strategy or views as well, or for the future? Obviously, congratulations as well. 2 weeks ago, you got a beautiful boy, I believe.
A little girl.
Girl, sorry, new baby.
Father of girls, so
New baby, so welcome to her, and that's fantastic. So, how do you see the future in that? And are you going to be on Netflix with a documentary on a family winery? Who knows?
So my sister and I are both very actively involved. We've both returned to the business the last, 6-7 years. It feels like last year, but that's just that much that's going on. Yeah, so that has been an important step. I think my parents, 98 till probably 2015 was them. From 2015, 2016 is them and us, and now we're able to plan out another 20, 30, 40 years. My children, perhaps, where the father and I are looking at planting another 20 hectares. That'll take us to 75 hectares, a really big vineyard. But that will produce great fruit in 20 years. So that's not even for me, to be honest. That's definitely not for my father. So you're able to take these longer arches, I think smaller steps on that front. But then we're doing great big steps on the other side. We're cognizant that people want to get out. They want to get out to nature. They can go and see the world and see food and have these amazing experiences. Australians are going to come to Singapore. Singaporeans are going to come to Australia. There will be just this desire to mix and match. And because of that, we're looking at building, putting some plans in from a hospitality angle. So a hotel and a high-grade restaurant on site. We've got a 3-hat chef we're working with who's putting it together, where hopefully will be involved. And so we're looking constantly at the future. We're not standing still. And if anything, this whole process has said innovation and forward direction is critical for survival and not just success. And so that sort of family just gives that longer term perspective. And I guess from a very micro perspective, my parents gave a new sparkling wine 2 years ago, named it after my first daughter, Annabelle. They've created a bit of a monster here because now we've got a second daughter and we have to create another wine. Fortunately, we have a Pinot Gris, our first Pinot Gris coming out this year. So there's Annabelle Cremant de Rosé, and now there'll be a Sophie Pinot Gris, which will be very fortunate. I wonder if we go for 3 children, what's the next wine we could do? But seeing as my father and I have no self-control over numbers of wines, it's possible. So,
that's great. Great story, and all the best wishes to your family, obviously, for Sophie. That's fantastic as well.
Thank you. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Well, virtual cling or chin or cheers.
Cheers.
Cling.